Hello, Buckeye fans, and welcome to another episode of the Bucknuts Happy Hour. I am Patrick Murphy, and we've got a bit of a different show today. We are certainly going to talk some Buckeyes, but we're also going to talk a little bit about the rest of college football, kind of what you should expect from contenders, other teams that could get in the mix, that type of stuff. We'll bring in our guy, Brad Crawford from 24/7 Sports and CBS Sports here in just a minute, but I know it's a Tuesday. I usually do these podcasts later in the week, but we still have to have our happy hour beer. So I've got a Bud Light here. Crack it. We'll maybe take it a little slower than usual today, but still in the happy hour spirit as we talk some Buckeyes. But let's get to it here. We got lots to talk about. Let's bring in Brad. Brad, what's going on, my man?
Good to see you, Pat. I'm ready for a exciting season with first year of the expanded playoff, which means a crap load of SEC and Big Ten teams at the end of the year.
Yeah, that's the way most people think it's going to go. Well, let me just start you off with an easy one on that topic. Will the Buckeyes win the national championship? Simple question.
They're my preseason pick, too. If I was Nostradamus, I would say yes. I would probably lay odds right now on Ohio State doing so. I'm sure we'll dive into why they will or won't in a bit, but Ohio State on paper, I think, has the best roster in football and certainly the best on the defensive side of the ball.
Yeah, well, let's go ahead and talk about the Buckeyes while we're on the topic. Everyone that's going to listen to this has heard Dave, Steve, and I talk a lot about it. They've paid attention to everything going on here, but you have a different perspective coming from outside of Buckeye Nation, outside of Columbus. What is it about the Buckeyes that really stands out to you?
Yeah, Pat, I've covered national football now for 5 or 6 years, the SEC for about 12, and seeing Quinshon Judkins, who I thought was the SEC's top returning running back, head to Columbus this offseason, and then Caleb Downs. He was Alabama's best player overall returning over Jalen Milroe, the free safety there. Him also joining the Buckeyes. I mean, that's just two All-American candidates that Ryan Day now has at his disposal, as well as 8 or 9 returning starters on that side of the ball. Pretty darn good wide receiving core. Jeremiah Smith, 5-star freshman. So from an outsider's perspective that I am, like I said, Ohio State's roster is elite. I think it resembles some of the best Urban Meyer teams, the national title teams. And this is the year I think it all comes together for Ryan Day. And from a national standpoint, again, I think it better because there's going to be some unrest in Columbus if it does not.
Yeah, you took me exactly where I was going to go with my next question. So, we're around this coaching staff a lot here. And to me, you need to beat Michigan, especially this year. But do you view it as what they've been saying around here, natty or bust? Like, how hot do you think that seat gets for Ryan Day? Again, from a national perspective, if the Buckeyes say, make the playoff, win the Big Ten, but maybe don't make as deep of a run. Maybe don't even make it to the semifinals at this point.
Yeah, I think if Ohio State beats Michigan, wins the Big Ten, gets to the playoff as a top 4 seed, which they undoubtedly would as the Big Ten champion, I think Ryan Day's safe. You beat Michigan, you win a conference title, get to the playoff, you're safe. Now, if you lose to Michigan, you kind of back your way into the playoff, and then you lose a first-round game or something like that's bad news. That'd be 4 straight losses to Michigan, likely not winning the Big Ten, and then just getting in the playoff because, let's face it, you're the Buckeyes and you're probably a 10-win team. I don't think Ryan Day's on any kind of hot seat right now. Things can certainly change if Ohio State's 11-0 and loses to what I consider a pretty beatable Michigan team, at least on paper right now. I don't have Michigan as a preseason top 10 team. The roster is not comparable to what Day has in Columbus. So no hot seat right now for Ryan Day from a national standpoint. Things could change in a few months if this season goes awry.
We're going to get to Michigan. Don't worry. We will get your perspective on them. People certainly want to hear as much about Michigan as possible in Columbus these days. And if you have any questions for Brad, Buckeye questions, national college football questions, and you're watching this live, feel free to throw those in the chat. We'll get to some of those later on. You and I were talking just before we went on air. What would be the thing in your mind that holds the Buckeyes back?
Yeah, I think it would be poor offensive line play, maybe an injury or two up there. Buckeyes aren't real deep at that position compared to some other elites that I have in the national championship conversation. And then Will Howard, is he just a guy in Columbus, or is he going to be an All-American caliber player, all Big Ten type player? I don't think Will Howard has to be a Heisman finalist for this Ohio State team to be unbeaten, one of those top 4 seeds in the playoff. But he does need to be a difference maker. And I think at times last season, Pat, Kyle McCord was not of that difference-making level, at least in my opinion from the games I watched. I don't think Ohio State fans really, hated to see him leave for Syracuse. I think they upgraded there. Obviously, time will tell. We'll know in September if, Will Howard is going to be a guy or not. But I love the quarterback room at Ohio State. I wouldn't say the leash is all that long on Will Howard. There's some other guys who can certainly make plays. Being that I cover the SEC too specifically, Julian Saban's a guy that Alabama hated to lose. And if maybe he was a redshirt freshman right now, maybe he might be the guy who starts for Ohio State, but he just hasn't had enough time yet in Columbus to get those first-team reps. But I do think Saban down the road is going to be a hell of a quarterback for the Buckeyes.
Yeah, not to look too far ahead, but you think about what the Buckeyes are going to look like in 2025.
Yeah.
A lot of this talent we're going to talk about is going to be on its way to the NFL at that point. And a guy like Julian Saban having maybe that difference maker that you brought up at quarterback could be what keeps the Buckeyes in that, top 5 conversation going in next year. But we'll get to that in due time. A couple of the other things that we get talked about a lot, the offensive line, which you mentioned, but this receiver room, I know you brought it up earlier, but you lose a guy like Marvin Harrison, and maybe there's not the proven depth that Ohio State's had in some other years other than Akimbo Uka, but there are some guys I know you mentioned that you like in this room.
Yeah, Jeremiah Smith is, who I consider probably the top freshman in college football from a production standpoint. I mean, I'm projecting here, but I expect he will be out there with the ones here in a few weeks when Ohio State opens the season. I wrote a story this week, Pat, talking to several head coaches, offensive coordinators around college football. Who are the 5-star freshman guys at the wide receiver spot who are going to impact? Everybody said Jeremiah Smith. Everybody said Ryan Wingo at Texas. Everybody said Ryan Williams at Alabama. Those are 3 guys that, we had in our top 15 players overall this recruiting cycle, 2024 cycle at 24/7 Sports. So once again, the wide receiver room at Ohio State reloads. I think Carnell Tate's a guy that everybody's waiting to break out and really have a impact season. I think he can. And like I said, man, Will Howard does not have to be a Heisman finalist for this offense to produce explosive plays. He's got plenty of talent around him, Travion Henderson, Quinshon Judkins, and really good tight end play, and then 4 or 5 wide receivers deep. So just get those guys a football and watch them work.
When you talk about those 2 running backs, you having covered the sport as long as you have, when you have 2 talented running backs like that, how do you keep both guys happy?
Yeah, I sort of compare it to several years back. Dabo Swinney had, James Davis, C.J. Spiller, kind of thunder and lightning combo. We've seen McFadden and Felix Jones at Arkansas. I think Travion Henderson, if he's 100%, he's the home run threat. Quinshon Judkins, based on what I saw at Ole Miss last couple of years, he's more of a guy who's going to get, 5 or 6 yards, really bring down guys strong. But Henderson's the guy that is the game breaker. And I still think that he's probably the lead back for Ohio State. There's going to be a, lion's share of carries for both guys. Obviously, if Ohio State and Chip Kelly can keep both those ball carriers healthy, man, that rivals Penn State's running back room as far as the best in the country. But Travion Henderson and Quinshon Judkins, those guys also, regardless of toting the football, they're going to be catching it out of the backfield too.
Yeah. Yeah, it is still crazy to me. And this is after we've been out at 5 practices so far in fall camp, seeing both of those guys lining up. Caleb Downs too, is who you mentioned earlier. Just strange world that we live in now when guys I've watched the last couple of years, now all of a sudden they're on the Buckeye roster. It still just hasn't clicked.
I mean, imagine coming downhill in practice and having to hit Travion Henderson first, and then on second down you hit Quinshon Judkins. It's tough.
Yeah, it's going to be interesting to see how teams handle that. But you mentioned it. As long as they stay healthy, Quinshon has been healthy, but he's carried the ball a lot these first 2 years in college football. So maybe for the best that they've got 2 guys that can do it. You already talked a little bit about the defense. That secondary was one of the best in the country last year. Now, I know some people have pointed to the quarterback play in the Big Ten last season and said, well, maybe the numbers look a little bit better because there weren't a ton of, heavy pass offenses and whatnot. How do you view this secondary group, as you mentioned, including Caleb Downs this year?
Oh, and the 2 starting corners are early round picks. I mean, Ohio State's collective, Pat, being able to convince 5 or 6 of these guys who probably would have been early round picks in April to come back another season, that shows me that maybe we are in a national championship or bust type scenario. Because the collective, not only did they pay these guys, but they also told them, look, you can compete for a spot in that expanded playoff. You can come back in 2024 and beat Michigan for the first time in your career. And if both those things happen, I mean, those guys have to be happy. But this is a defense that I ranked in the spring as the top returning talent-wise in college football. I think Ohio State. I don't see a team on the schedule. Maybe Oregon, perhaps. I don't think Ohio State gives up more than 20 points in any game this season. And maybe they post a couple of shutouts. Maybe they have a couple of 7-point games. But this is a defense, and I'm sure Jim Knowles will say the same thing. And he has been sandbagging just a little bit in fall camp, but it's a group that should be one of the best in program history.
Yeah, Dave's talked about this quite a bit, specifically the secondary, that it's as good, at least on paper, as he can remember. And he's obviously been around doing this a long time with the Buckeyes. So we shall see how it plays out. I am interested to see what the defensive line looks like. The names are familiar, but the production, was there points last year? Now, Jim Knowles' defense doesn't necessarily need a ton of sacks, as we saw last year, to be successful. So what do you make of kind of the pressure that they could get on quarterbacks? Yeah,
they need Sawyer to be a difference maker for sure off the edge. And then Ty Leak's a guy that I had as a first-team preseason All-American. I was the only guy at CBS that actually voted him on that D-line list because, D-line, Pat, inside the top 10 of playoff contenders, all these teams, Ohio State, Penn State, Notre Dame, Alabama, Ole Miss, they all have former 4- and 5-star guys in the trenches. And Ohio State needs some of these guys to step up. JT's a guy we saw him a couple years ago at Penn State, had like a Heisman-type performance. Yeah. And you don't see those kind of numbers put up by edge rushers. So they're going to rotate some guys there. And like you said, they don't have to be tackle for loss and sack heavy because the cornerback and safety spots are so good at Ohio State. All they need is a little bit of pressure against some of these better quarterbacks on the schedule. And I think the defense production will be fine.
All right, let's get to some of the other teams across college football. We'll start with teams that top of the AP poll, contenders with Ohio State. I've had some people on our message board ask, we talk about all that talent on Ohio State. So why is everyone putting Georgia number 1? Well, for people that haven't paid a ton of attention to what Georgia, who did just miss out on the playoff last year after winning back-to-back national titles, why is Georgia the number 1 team in the country heading into the season?
Yeah, comparatively to Ohio State, Georgia is undoubtedly better at the quarterback spot. Carson Beck might be the number 1 overall pick in the 2025 NFL draft. Georgia's going to start 3 former 5-star linebackers, so they're better than Ohio State at the linebacker spot. Ohio State obviously has them, I think, at the secondary, at running back, and at wide receiver. It's 2 very comparable rosters, to be honest with you. The SEC's best versus the Big Ten's best, but I think Kirby Smart gets the benefit of the doubt because he does have 2 national championships. And last season, even though Georgia did not make the playoff, they were 12-0 going to Atlanta, lost to Alabama by 3 points, probably were one of the 4 best teams in the country in December, but they couldn't get in because Bama had already lost to Texas. Texas won the Big 12. The committee had kind of a chaotic scenario there with Florida State unbeaten as well. So I actually had Ohio State as my number 1 preseason team because I don't think 2024 has anything to do with 2023. AP voters obviously did not feel the same. And Ryan Day's a guy that does not have a ring yet, so he has to prove it on the big stage.
I look at Georgia's schedule. Ohio State starts pretty slow out of the gates. First 3 games, teams that you'd expect them to be favored by a ton. Yeah. Then you get Michigan State on the road. You get Iowa before you head out to Oregon. Georgia starts off against Clemson. You get Tennessee Tech, and then Kentucky, at Alabama. What do you make of kind of the start to this season? Obviously, if they win those games, maybe they pull away some in the rankings, but that is not the easiest start for a team, even a team as talented as Georgia.
And then looking a bit further, man, they're the only SEC team that goes to Alabama, goes to Texas, and goes to Ole Miss. That's 3 of the top 6 in the AP poll. I mean, Georgia has a 39-game winning streak in the regular season under Kirby Smart. That undoubtedly ends this season. It's the toughest slate that Smart's had to face so far. during his career in Athens. I think Georgia has a schedule that's tough enough where they might not even make the SEC championship game at 10-2, but how could you lead them out of the playoff based on some of these wins that they're going to have? So I do think Georgia's going to be tested early. I don't think Clemson's a game where you have to worry about it, but if that game does, go into the fourth quarter and maybe Georgia wins by a touchdown or a field goal, I'd probably press the panic button just a little bit if I'm a Georgia fan, because Clemson right now does not have the roster comparable to Georgia. And if that game's close in Atlanta, there's some bigger issues at hand for Kirby Smart.
To me, that game feels a little bit like some of those Alabama neutral site games
where USC, Alabama,
yeah, like maybe it's not all perfect, but then Alabama pulls away and it's Alabama, right? We'll see how it plays out. I am excited for that one, week 1. Unfortunately, it's a noon game, so I'm going to have to leave at halftime to head over to Ohio Stadium. But, I can't complain too much about what we did.
You get LSU, Southern Cal the following night, so that's a good one.
That is always a great weekend. You get the start on Thursday, you get game Saturday, Sunday. Yeah, it's awesome. All right. Oregon obviously is a game that Ohio State fans have circled. It's the first real test for the Buckeyes. There's been a lot of talk about the Ducks under Dan Lanning after last season. Number 3 team in the AP poll. How do you see Oregon, shaping up this year? And what do you make of that game October 12th?
Yeah, I've got a little bit altered opinion of Oregon than most national guys. Dylan Gabriel is not my top transfer quarterback this cycle. I think Cam Ward at Miami is a better player. Gabriel's a guy that, he's kind of like a Bo Nix clone, right? He's going to fit perfect in that Will Stein offense. He's going to throw 45 touchdown passes this season, and then he's probably a day 3 NFL draft pick. I don't think Dylan Gabriel scares Ohio State's defensive staff with the personnel the Buckeyes have coming back. I do think Ohio State and Oregon probably play at least twice this season. Obviously, they're going to meet at Alson Stadium, like you said, the middle of the year. Probably going to meet in Indy. Might even play in the playoff in one of those semifinal type games. But Dan Lanning so far, like some other high-end coaches, has also received the benefit of the doubt. He hasn't beaten anybody of substance yet at Oregon, but he keeps finishing 9-10 wins. I would not put Oregon number 3 in the AP poll. I had him behind Texas and Ole Miss actually at number 5, but Oregon's a team certainly that of the SEC and Big Ten newcomers, I expect to be in the thick of that playoff, conversation in November. And based on how Lanning has handled the transfer portal, he's doing a heck of a job.
I'm glad you said that about Gabriel, because I said this to somebody at
system player, man.
Yeah, I agree. And I said this to somebody at Big Ten Media Days, and obviously he had just talked, and there's talk about Heisman buzz and things like that. And I was just like, I don't know if I see that based on what he did at Oklahoma, and obviously different stuff. And I got looked at like I was crazy. So I'm glad at least you agree with me on that.
Yeah, he can get mistake prone every now and then. And Oregon schedule, there's a week 2 or week 3 game at home against Boise State. That's a game that I sort of have the Ducks on upset alert, before Big Ten play starts. And if Gabriel throws 2 or 3 picks in that game, then his Heisman front running status all of a sudden drops out the top 10.
Yeah, that makes sense. You mentioned Texas earlier, coming to the SEC off of a college football playoff. Is Texas still back?
I think the Longhorns are definitely back. This time last summer, I had them in my preseason top 4. Nobody else did. I thought they'd make the playoff, and they did. They won the Big 12. The roster might not be quite as good as it was last season. They did lose 2 really good defensive linemen. Based on every source in Austin that I've talked to, especially at SEC Media Days a couple weeks ago in Dallas, there's some worry, Pat, that the defensive pass rush is not going to be what it was last season. And there were times where Steve Sarkisian's Longhorns dominated the trenches. They beat Alabama in Tuscaloosa last season because they won the line of scrimmage. Now, if Texas does that again and can win up front, at the point of attack in the SEC, they're going to Atlanta as probably the SEC champ or runner-up. I do have Texas as one of my 4 SEC playoff teams. They're loaded, and if Quinn Ewers plays bad or gets hurt, they've got a 5-star behind him in Arch Manning, who's going to certainly play as well.
Alabama obviously starting a new era. Nick Saban retires. I think the logical thing to assume is you don't want to be the guy that follows the GOAT, right?
Yeah.
but there seems to be less concern about that right now in Tuscaloosa. How do you look at what's coming in Alabama and kind of how you sustain, or can they sustain, some of the success? I know it hasn't been the same level the last couple of years as when Nick Saban had it really rolling, but is this a Bama team that'll be as good as some people think, at least based on these rankings?
Potentially. It's a completely different philosophical approach. Every Alabama player I spoke to at SEC Media Days said that, like, practices are lively. There's no screaming. There's no cussing. We get to celebrate big plays. And they haven't seen that, man, in more than a decade at Alabama. Not to question Nick Saban's coaching, though, because it obviously worked, man. Half a dozen national championships, the same amount of SEC titles. But I do think there's going to be some growing pains, at least early in Kalen DeBoer's career. Lofty expectations, they aren't any higher anywhere nationally than Tuscaloosa. And this schedule is very difficult, not to mention they go to Camp Randall in September. That's a non-conference game, and they play USF, a team that I think could win the G5. So even outside of SEC play, Bama plays two teams I consider probably top 30 level squads. So we're gonna see early before SEC play starts if this Bama team is legit or not. I have some questions about Jalen Milroe being a Michael Penix type player, because Kalen DeBoer is used to a guy who can just throw it around all around the yard, and Jalen Milroe ain't that. He's a dual threat, athletic kid, but he's not a great developed passer already. So I've got Bama as my fourth and final SEC playoff team, but it's going to be close. LSU, Tennessee, Alabama, those three teams, one of those three is going to make the playoff.
You've referenced your playoff teams.
Yeah.
Who do you have in, and in what spots?
Yeah, I've got four from the SEC. I think Georgia, Texas, Ole Miss, and Alabama are those four teams. I don't know about seeds yet. I'd probably still go Georgia as my preseason SEC favorite. Ohio State, Penn State, and Oregon are the three Big Ten. And you've got Notre Dame. The schedule is so easy, man, that they can show up and win 10 games, and they're in. They play two teams, top 20 preseason, and that's it. So there's your eighth team. G5 champions, 9. You've got 2 from the ACC. I've got Florida State and Miami are my 2 ACC teams. And the Big 12 champion is the 12th team. It's pick your poison. I mean, it could be Utah, Oklahoma State, Kansas State with Avery Johnson. Those are I feel pretty confident, though, in those squads. Liberty's a team, too, that I was kind of surprised is not ranked in the AP poll preseason. They brought almost everybody back. Caden Salter, a quarterback that Hugh Freeze tried to tamper with and get the transfer portal, and did not get him. So I expect Liberty to be 12-0 again, and hopefully not get, blitzkrieged in the playoff.
While we're talking college football playoff, I'm curious just your perspective on a 12-team playoff. We got used to the 4-team.
Yeah.
They've made the move to 12. Some people say 16. Some people say 8. The thing for me that stands out the most is that you're almost rewarding the teams that don't finish in the top 4 by potentially giving them the home game, though you do get the bye. Just what are your overall thoughts on this since we're on the topic?
Yeah, the SEC Big Ten Invitational is what I've been calling it. And I mean, expansion is solely a money grab. I don't think it'll be long, Pat, before we see 16, 20, may even go to 24. And with a 25 play-in game, just to put 2 more teams, so-called in the mix. I think for the next 5 to 10 years, we're still going to see the same half dozen to maybe 10 programs with a chance to win it all. If you're top 10 every year in NIL and recruiting, you have a legitimate chance to win the national championship. If you're not going to win it. You might get in as your 11 or 12 seed, but a team like Liberty or Tulane, maybe even a 4th place Big Ten team, maybe Iowa, for instance, they don't recruit at a level that you can win multiple games in December, another game in January, and then get to the final. We're talking about beating like 3 top 10 teams just to have a chance to win it all. It's not going to happen. The Ohio States, Notre Dame's, Alabama's, Georgia's, it's going to always be those half dozen teams. And as a college football fan and analyst, we can call it parity, but I mean, no. The next 10 years, I think we're going to see probably 4 or 5 different champions, and that's it.
When you look at the teams you have in, Is there a team on the outside of that mix that you think could maybe surprise some people, get in, maybe win a game or two? Just kind of an off-the-wall pick that you're kind of pegging for. Keep an eye on this team.
Yeah, I live in North Carolina. I hate to do a homer pick here, but NC State's number 22 in the AP poll preseason. And I followed that program for about 20 years, man, since I was a kid. And this is the most hype NC State's had. Okay. They've won 9 games 4 times under this current coaching staff. Should have won 10 last year, blew a couple, did beat Clemson. And they play Tennessee and Clemson in September. If NC State wins both of those games, then they're probably going to look at a potential playoff team. And if they go 11-1, maybe lose to Florida State in the AC Championship, they're probably still in because the schedule is good enough. They've got Noah Rogers, former Ohio State receiver.
Yep.
I've been told he is just ripping things up in fall camp. They've got Grayson McCall from Coastal Carolina, has 100 career touchdown passes. Nobody's talking about him out of the portal. So NC State's a team that I would not be surprised at worst wins 10 games.
Yeah, Noah Rogers was a guy that I know people on this staff at Ohio State weren't going to lose sleep over it. Obviously, this receiver room's loaded, but we're not happy to see him enter the portal and head home. Though I think some people saw the writing on the wall towards the end of the season, and obviously he has a great opportunity to be close to home and have success there. Before I let you go, I want to talk to you about Michigan. Obviously, that's a team you did not mention in the mix for things other than when we were talking about that last game of the season against Ohio State. Obviously wins a national championship last year. Lots of controversy around the last 3 years with the recruiting stuff that's now come out. And then obviously the follow-up with the what are we calling it now? The Spygate
cloud.
There, yeah. There you go. What do you just make of the Wolverines? Obviously, you lose Jim Harbaugh too. You got Sharon Moore, who has some coaching experience now, but has never been the full-time head coach. As you look at this season, do you just take this as hey, we won the national championship last year. This season is a wash?
I would be really nervous if I was a Michigan fan with Texas coming in week 2. That's a game where, if Michigan gets down a touchdown or 2 in that first half, the wheels might come off on this entire season. Now, I don't have Michigan as a playoff team. I think I put them 4th in my preseason Big Ten power rankings because on defense, you still have to like the personnel. Will Johnson and Mason Graham are going to be first-round picks. And they got Jayshon Barham, the 5-star linebacker from Maryland. He's probably an all-Big Ten player. But there are so many questions, man, on the other side of the football with Orji at quarterback. You don't really know who the weapons are. Donovan Edwards has had like 4 good games in his entire career. Just so happens 2 of them have come against Ohio State. But he's a guy that now he's going to be running back 1 for the first time in his career. We don't know if he can handle that workload. So Michigan's a team that I think could certainly go 8-4 and fall well below expectations. I was actually asked today at CBS, which preseason top 10 team do you think could be unranked at the end of the year? Because we've seen that for 10 straight years in the AP poll. And I think Michigan's that team. And that week that the early game against Texas, man, is so important for both programs, but especially Michigan because, we don't know how Sharon Moore is as a head coach so far. We know he's a great offensive line coach, and he's tenacious and gets the most out of his guys, but he's going against Steve Sarkisian, a team, and the Longhorns team that could certainly win the SEC. So I'm going to be watching that game with some SEC goggles on for sure.
Sure. And I wouldn't, if we're talking Michigan, I wouldn't be doing my Ohio State listeners justice if I didn't ask you what you think ends up happening with the NCAA cloud, as you mentioned, or as you called it.
Yeah, I think sanctions are obviously coming down. All this retroactive wins and all that, none of that stuff matters to me. Michigan won every game on the field. Did they cheat? Most likely so, they did. Bill Belichick cheated for more than a decade in the NFL with the Patriots, and he's still considered one of the greatest coaches, if not the greatest in NFL history. So Michigan fans probably shouldn't lose sleep over any of this, but I do find it interesting that, Michigan put out that statement today that Jim Harbaugh is not going to be honored at halftime or whatever of the opener because he's solely focused on the Chargers. Yeah, he also doesn't want to get pie in his face for everything he did these last, 5 to 6 years. So I don't know, though. If I'm an Ohio State fan right now, I wouldn't pile on because, you never know when the other shoe drops at another
Sure.
program. NCAA is looking everywhere right now, man.
Yeah, well, in Ohio State, it's been a long time, but the Tatgate stuff happened, and
Yeah, and some
Michigan.
autographs. Who cares?
Right. All right, Brad. Well, I kept you longer than I said I would, but I really appreciate it. I think you gave some great insight to, the big picture of college football stuff was exactly what I was looking for. So thank you very much for your time.
Hopefully, man, I can get to Ohio State this year for a game or two.
That would be great. It's been too long since I've seen you in person.
Yeah, man. Good to see you.
You too, Brad. Talk to you later. All right. Thanks again. That was Brad Crawford. He does stuff for both 24/7 Sports and CBS Sports. You can find his work. We use a lot of his stuff on Bucknuts, so you've probably read some of Brad's stuff, even if you didn't realize it at the time. But a guy I've worked with closely for periods of time during my time with 24/7 Sports and Bucknuts. But check out Brad's work. Again, if you have any questions, I don't think I saw many. I wasn't paying full attention. If you have any Buckeye questions, college football questions, throw those in the chat. If you're watching this live, we will have a little bit of time after I get to the last thing that I want to talk about here, which Brad touched on a little bit while talking about both the offense and defense at Ohio State. And this is something I'm working on a story on, but give you a little sneak peek of it. The battle between Ohio State's wide receivers and Ohio State's secondary. And I think this may be one of the potentially defining things of the season for the Buckeyes. And this is nothing new. At least last year, and then from 2019 and a little bit before that, the Buckeyes have, iron sharpens iron is the expression, right? And they have successfully battled between some top wide receiver units and some top secondaries. Now, there were some years where the wide receivers were absolutely dominating a subpar secondary, 2020, 2021, before Jim Knowles arrived and Tim Walton arrived. But these last two seasons, I think you've started to see the results of what happens in practice every day. And this is not just true for wide receivers and cornerbacks, but it's been very clear in the 5 fall camp practices that we've been at and been able to watch all of, that the battle between that group of Akimbo Uka, Carnell Tate, Jeremiah Smith, Brandon Innes, go on down the line receivers, and then on the other side of the ball, Denzel Burke, Davison Igbinosun, Jordan Hancock, Jermaine Matthews, again, can keep going down that list as well. Like how much better this has made these guys. And we got to talk to both the cornerbacks and the wide receivers this past week, and that came up quite a bit. And what's maybe the most fun about it is you get to see the battle, but being at practice, you get to see these guys chirp at each other. And, obviously if you're watching a game on television, you can see some of that back and forth between a cornerback and a wide receiver. But kind of being up close and seeing that in person and teammates, not anything that crossed the line, but just, letting the other guy hear it a little bit when you make a play. I'm sure you guys have all heard about it by now, but last week they were, I think it was a 4th down play right by the end zone. And I want to say it was Will Howard. I'm not sure which quarterback it was. Threw to the corner of the end zone for Jeremiah Smith, and Davison Igbinosun was able to get in there and deflect the ball away. And they both kind of went down. Davison Igbinosun stood up and he just let Jeremiah Smith hear it. And Jeremiah Smith just took it, kind of nodded. And then I want to say it was like 4 or 5 plays later, going the other way on the other side of the field, Jeremiah Smith catches a pass. I talked about this a little bit on a show we did last week, but Jeremiah Smith catches a pass on Davison Igbinosun again, and we couldn't tell if anything was said. Jeremiah told us, he just said, I told you I'd be back. And this is the dynamic that I think is going to really help both sides of the ball. And look, you may say that this secondary doesn't need to, that type of motivation, that type of stuff every day in practice, but you got to keep getting better, right? And I think if you were this secondary and you were going against a passing attack in practice that doesn't challenge you. If you didn't have an Akimbo Uka, Carnell Tate, Jeremiah Smith, Brandon, and again, list goes on and on. Maybe you start to, you're good. You're seeing it every day in practice because you're not going against elite receivers. And so maybe you start to feel yourself a little bit and you get out there and down the road, when you start playing Big Ten teams, you start playing Oregon, maybe you're not as prepared, but these guys are going against each other every day. And so it's not like they can take days off just because they ranked as the best statistical secondary in the country, because then they just get burned by these Ohio State receivers. And on the flip side, other than Akimbo Uka, not much has happened on Saturdays in the fall from this group of receivers. Carnell Tate has 18 catches and 1 touchdown. Brandon Inniss has 1 catch for 1 touchdown against Purdue. Jeremiah Smith has never played in a college football game. Again, it's just not a ton of experience. Ryan Day's talked about this. So while you can't fully create the situations they're going to face on game day, what you can do is put them up against arguably the best corners in the country and let them go to work. And, as they've said, those will be the best DBs they face maybe all season. And if you can make plays there, then you're ready on Saturdays to make plays, even if you haven't done it on a consistent basis or done it at all. And I think for a guy like Akimbo Uka, similarly to those cornerbacks, this is your chance to get better. You have been 2 years ago, you were one of the best wide receivers in the country. Even if people weren't talking about it, you look at those numbers in comparison to Marvin Harrison Jr., any receiver 2 seasons ago, Akimbo Uka was right there. He's one of the best receivers in the country. Last year, injuries, whatnot, take a step back, maybe not the same level of quarterback play. Now's your chance. Get better this camp by, again, going against these corners every single day and go out there and as a senior, prove that you are 1, 2, 3 in terms of the best receivers in the country. This is his last chance to make a case for the NFL, and you need to be prepared to go into this season and be at your best. And I don't have any doubt that Emeka, assuming he stays healthy, will do that. But the fact that he is being challenged in practice every day is what you want to see. And I think it's been fun to watch the battles between these guys. And I'll have a story about it. It goes into more detail about some of the stuff we've seen and quotes from the players. That'll probably be up on the site tomorrow. If you want, while we're on the topic of wide receivers, I did write a story about Carnell Tate that I found very interesting. Just, this is a guy who was one of the top receivers in the country a year ago. Now, I don't think many people are talking about him. Jeremiah Smith has obviously dominated the conversation, and rightfully so. Everybody loves the new shiny thing, no doubt about it. And he has earned the right with some of the stuff he's done in practice. And based on what we've heard and what coaches have said, the way he works every day and doesn't listen to hype and things like that. And I wrote about his story too last week. But Carnell Tate is a guy who I think, if you were to place season-long bets on Ohio State receivers, Carnell Tate is a guy that I think you could probably get some pretty good value on for some numbers. I haven't looked this up, but I'm assuming, just because there's not a lot of buzz around him, and that is a really good player. I think Brandon Inniss too. Obviously, he's going to be in a little bit different role, playing some behind Akimbo Uka, but those are 2 guys that maybe people are sleeping on a little bit. Maybe not. We'll see how it all plays out, but I think Carnell Tate could have a really big season. He's essentially going to step into that Marvin Harrison Jr. role in terms of being the X receiver, and I think he can put up similar numbers. I don't know if he'll be quite as I don't know if he'll be exactly what Marv was, but I think he can do some really special things, and I don't think that there's any doubt that he has put himself in that position, similar to what Marv did in terms of the way he performs and things like that. Okay, let's see if we got any questions in here before we close this out. Wesley Calendar asked, what are you sipping on today? I started off, it's just a Bud Light. It's a Tuesday. Don't want to get too crazy. Got a little bit more work to do before we call it at the end of the day. So yeah, just a Well, it's in a Sam Adams glass, but it is a Bud Light, something easy. There were a couple things in the fridge that it's like, I don't need to do that at 4:00 on a Tuesday when we started this. Billy Tuesday, tell us all you've heard about Saturday's scrimmage. I posted this on our message board. Ever since Ryan Day got here, the scrimmages have been pretty tight-lipped. I think often when you hear things from the scrimmage, it's a lot of it's negative things, right? The reason that people often talk is either somebody gets hurt or somebody doesn't look good, things like that. Now, that's not to say that there isn't some information out there. And if you're a Bucknuts subscriber, I put together some things about that that you can read on there. But I will say this. I was told that the offense looked good. I believe some of the offensive linemen that have been out with illness may have been banged up or that they have come back, excuse me. We'll see how that shapes up next week. But the offense had a solid day, was more or less how it was described to me. I had somebody else say that more or less what you've seen in practice. So, I think that's all positive. But again, there was not a ton of information, I think, that came out. I don't know what is reported elsewhere, but based on people we talk to normally, you often don't get a lot of responses when you ask about these scrimmages because they don't want that stuff out there right now, and at least until they talk about it publicly. Matt Henry asks, what do you think happens with Sanders Jr.? That is David Sanders Jr., the top-ranked offensive lineman who will commit or announce his commitment on Saturday on the 24/7 Sports YouTube channel, which you can check out. I believe it's at 1:15, I think it's 1:15 p.m. Eastern time. That is, I think that's the $1 million question. If you listen to the Bucknuts Morning Five this morning with Bill Kurlick and Mark Porter, I know they talked extensively about Sanders, and they would know a lot more than I do because they cover recruiting predominantly. But I think if you look at kind of the way things have been going, I think it's going to come down to Tennessee and Ohio State. I know there have been some crystal ball picks put in for Tennessee, but based on kind of the conversations I've had with Bill, I don't think anyone feels 100% that he has made up his mind and that he's going one place or the other. I think the fact that the idea that maybe people are leaning Tennessee for him is more so because he took another official visit there more recently than he has Ohio State. I don't know kind of his thought process throughout all of this, but I say this with a lot of big time recruits. And I think there are some that Ohio State have been after previously. Like, it's not over till it's over, until he signs that letter of intent. And this is true whether he commits to Ohio State or Tennessee or if it's somewhere else. The Buckeyes will continue to do what they have to do to get him on campus and whatnot. And even if he commits to Ohio State, that work isn't done for a player of that talent and somebody who is, going to continue to be recruited by other programs throughout. So the battle will not be over regardless of what happens in terms of his commitment on Saturday. That doesn't mean he won't stick with what he's doing, but teams will continue to recruit him. Whoever he commits to will have to continue to recruit him. And we'll just see how it all plays out. And look, I know it's a big one. It's a real big one. Maybe one of the biggest in kind of this late in a process that we've had in a while, a guy making up his mind, and they could certainly use a boost in that offensive line recruiting. I've said it before. I know there's a lot of complaints about Justin Fry. I think it's a big year for Justin Fry, not necessarily recruiting, though that's part of it too, but the development of these linemen. I think that, that is where Justin Fry has kind of made his name, is developing offensive linemen. And if you can get, the level of production you need from this group, which includes a transfer from San Diego State, who was not at his best at the start of last year, but got better. a center from Alabama, probably, who had some issues last year for the Crimson Tide in terms of snapping, even if it's Carson Hinsman and he improves at center after having some struggles as a starter last year for the Buckeyes. If Tegra Shabola, for instance, wins that right guard job, you may have noticed I skipped Donovan Jackson. He's going to be just fine at left guard. But if you've got Tegra Shabola finally playing like what Tegra Shabola looks like he's playing, and Josh Fryer takes a big step, and all of a sudden this is a pretty consistent offensive line, a good offensive line, then I think you feel good about Justin Frye, the developer. Now, maybe he needs to still develop in terms of a recruiter if he doesn't land a guy like Sanders, because you're Ohio State. You should be landing some very top guys at the position, at every position. But as I've said multiple times when this has come up, offensive line is one of the hardest positions to evaluate high school players and know what they're going to be at the next level. And I think, those of us, those who do it at 24/7 Sports, I think they do a great job, but you'll see guys that slip through the cracks in terms of their rankings, or even slip through the cracks in terms of where they end up at school, that get drafted pretty high in the NFL draft. And I think that, that's just a sign of kind of how difficult it is to evaluate high school offensive linemen. And there are guys on this roster that maybe weren't ranked as high by us that I know that the Buckeyes are pretty high on. I watched the Armstrong twins this last week, having to play kind of up a spot from maybe where they were. And I think, okay, you've seen them. I've seen them physically develop. Now I'm seeing them play against a pretty good defensive line in Ohio State. And, the defensive line certainly won more often than not because there were so many backups in because guys were sick. But that's going to be really good experience. And I think they did relatively well to hold their own. So, if Ohio State can develop these offensive linemen, still need to recruit good guys. And a guy like David Sanders, you're this far in the process, it's going to be a tough miss if you miss on him. It'll be a great win if you get him as well. But I do think if Justin Frye can prove to be that developer that I think Ohio State expected from him, now you feel a little bit better about what may be coming down the pipeline. And obviously that will all depend on what you see on the field this year with the group that has the potential to surprise some people, I think, if they can build on some of the growth they made last year and what we've heard about what they've done this offseason. All right, I'm going to end it with that. The point of this show was very much to talk with Brad about college football from a national perspective. I thought he gave some really good answers to some of those questions. All right, I got one more question. I just saw it pop up. Kenny Braskett, what do you think of our running game this year? And I'm answering this specifically because I don't think, at least we've talked about it enough. Brad did talk about it a little bit, but Quinshon Judkins, Traven Henderson, if those two stay healthy, I think this could be a team that goes back to like a 2019, maybe leaning on that a little bit more, leaning on the run game a little bit more. You have Will Howard or whoever wins the job, but I expect it to be Will Howard that can run the ball. You have two really good running backs. 2019, obviously, it was J.K. Dobbins. You still have some good receivers. You're going to pass the ball. But I think this could be a very good rushing attack. They haven't been as good. Some of that's had to do with injuries. Some of it's had to do with offensive line play, things like that. But this has the potential to be a scary good rushing attack. You combine that with the weapons on the outside, hopefully an improved offensive line. You expect the Buckeyes to take a jump back closer to what they've been under Ryan Day. But, yeah, I mean, as long as Travion Henderson and Quinshon Judkins stay healthy, we've seen some things in practice that they can do. I think you've got a really good tandem there. And I'll bring this up. James Peoples is a guy that I've been impressed with both on the field and when we got to interview him. He reminds me a lot of some of the successful young Ohio State running backs. Now, you hope, if you're Ohio State, that you don't have to go that far down the depth chart to James Peoples a lot. He'll certainly get some carries this year, no doubt about it. But I think that there's a player there that certainly, if not this year, next year, will make an impact. But I do think the rushing game, again, given health, will be very good. Easy to say this time of year. I had somebody call me out the other day because I was saying too many positive things about Ohio State. It's like, well, you're watching these things in practice. You're hearing all these good things. It's easy to be positive right now, but I do think, Brad talked about it again. This should be one of the best teams in the country, and it's not just because of that defense, which is what it predominantly was last year. So wrap it up on that note. thank you all. Thank you to Brad Crawford for joining us to kind of give a national perspective on Ohio State, college football at large, some of the top teams in the country, some surprise teams maybe. We talked a little Michigan too, because why not? So if you missed any of that, you'll be able to find this on all of the normal platforms. But thank you guys for tuning in. And until next week, cheers.